Welcome back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival protected by Dettol. It is our pleasure today to present The Wake-Up Call, John Micklethwait in conversation with Suhasini Haidar. Exposing the deep fault lines within governments across the world in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, author and journalist John Micklethwait's latest book, co-authored with Adrian Woolridge, The Wake-Up Call, Why the Pandemic Has Exposed the Weakness of the West and How to Fix It, offers both critical analysis and solutions. Micklethwait is the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg. In conversation with journalist Suhasini Haidar, Micklethwait takes a sharp look at global power shifts and the necessity for a structural paradigm shift within governments. John Micklethwait is the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, where he oversees editorial content across all Bloomberg platforms, including its news, newsletters, magazines, opinion, television, radio and digital properties, as well as its research services, including Bloomberg Intelligence. Prior to joining Bloomberg in February 2015, Micklethwait was editor-in-chief of The Economist, where he led the newspaper into the digital age while expanding its readership and enhancing its reputation. He is the co-author of 7 books. Suhasini Haidar is the diplomatic and national editor at The Hindu. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present The Wake-Up Call, John Micklethwait in conversation with Suhasini Haidar. Over to you, Suhasini.
Thanks so much, and thank you to JLF for having us on for this very interesting discussion. If you aren't awake, what John Micklethwait tells you in the next 40 minutes will certainly wake you up. Well, COVID, in a sense, was a forced pause for the world on steroids, at least for the first year. What we saw in terms of the lockdowns and all that followed, the worry about the medicines, the worry about the vaccines, all of that has forced us to stop and think about the kind of lives we are leading, confront questions that perhaps we only paid lip service to, like health security, the digital divide, access to food during the lockdowns became another question. And many of us took that hard look at ourselves, what we needed compared to what we already owned. We looked around at the environment and said, you know, it can actually be a lot better than it is right now. But John Micklethwait and Adrian Woolridge, who have written books before together, actually took the time to write a book about the pandemic, if I may say so, during the pandemic itself, because it isn't really over yet. So to start with, John, I do want to ask you, was this meant to be instant analysis? Did the book come too early? Why did you decide to write it now?
I think, well, it's up to you to judge whether it came too early. It was instant analysis, I think, in one way, but I think most of what has happened since then has kind of reconfirmed what we thought. And you know, it's often you write books and then a year later you think, was I quite right? In this case, I think on the big picture, I think we were right. And there were 2 sort of basic messages of this book. The first was, as you hinted at, that government mattered. This was the first time where it was really evident that kind of good government was the difference between living and dying. And you can see that most clearly by the numbers of thousands, but the number of people dead per million inhabitants. I just checked earlier, Britain, where I live, is up around 1,700 people for every million inhabitants. America's around 1,400. You go down the other end of the scale, you get places in Asia, and you end up with people with 40, 50, 60 deaths per million inhabitants. So sort of 20, 30 times better. And that was the difference between having good government and bad government. And that was one thing that we fixated on. And that came very much from a position of, as you mentioned, we were at The Economist, Adrian still is at The Economist. It's a very free market organ, and we'd often focused on the private sector. But the lesson for the West at the moment is government matters. And the second part of the message of the book, it could be summed up by one number. China claims a number of 3 deaths for every million people. Just repeat it, that's 3 against America's 1,400. And what's interesting about that is even if you ascribe a healthy degree of skepticism to that number of 3, imagine that we think that China is hiding 9 out of 10 deaths. Possibly, I think, I probably have more people working for me in China than any other journalistic institution. I don't think we think they're hiding that many, but just imagine you say they are. So they're up at 30 deaths. That would still put them 40, 50 times better than America. And that, to us, symbolized a second thing, is it sent the sense that Asia was back. Because if you go back to the first great book about government, written by Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, back then, Asia was the superpower. China was by far the biggest economy in the world. Europe was a bloody battlefield off to the other end of Eurasia. And then Europe got ahead by being much better at government than Asia. We competed against each other. The English blew the French out of the water. French blew the English out of the water. The Chinese when they invented gunpowder, they used it for fireworks. We used it for ammunition. Terrible things happened to that, some of them in India. But basically, it was a struggle to be better. And by 1960s, you had a very clear thing that you had America, I suppose then the leading country of the West, dreaming about putting a man on the moon whilst millions of Chinese died of starvation. Since then, you've seen Asia, a particularly Asian style of government in Singapore. I know one that India hasn't wholly embraced, but other countries around Asia have begun to. And the fact that China is following that model, albeit in a slightly different way, to us, that spells a real challenge to the old ideas of the West. And I think when you look at the West, you have to look at it both geographically, sort of Europe and America, but you also have to look at it as a set of ideas. And both those are under attack. And on the whole, I think a year later, I think we would argue that both those things are true. Government matters even more. And the contest between the West and particularly China is even stronger.
Sure, and a lot of your book actually deals with the governance issues involving and where the governments and you, since you have focused on the West, have really failed. So take us through what you think are maybe the 3 or 4 most salient sort of lessons learned and places where American governance has failed or British governance has failed or the West has failed in that sense.
I think they vary in different levels. I think in America, you could claim that the fact you had no public health service, the fact that you have a health service that is designed to look after the old and the rich rather than the poor, always meant that a pandemic was going to hit it hard. In a sense, yes, Donald Trump made plenty of very bizarre mistakes. But if you have that kind of structure, it was always going to be exposed. I think at the other end, I think many of the mistakes that Britain made at the beginning were actually slightly the reverse. It was NHS being a control freak about how to do testing and so on. The interesting thing about this, and because in a conversation with Adam Gopnik at Jaipur as well, is that you look at the sort of mistakes people have made. They're fairly basic ones with just sort of simply looking around the world and seeing what works. We interviewed one of the heads of one of the world's most famous companies, and he wasn't any different to most Western leaders. What happened was that he saw COVID appearing in China. He thought to begin with it was just a Chinese thing. Then he wondered whether it was something that would just be somewhat regional in Asia. But by the end of February, he was jumping all over the place, trying to work out what he had to do with his people in Asia, to be sure, but also what to do in America. And what scandalized him was when you went to go and see American government officials, the people who regulated him, they weren't looking to see what was happening in Asia. By the end of February, to glorify my old publication, the Economist had COVID Goes Global on its cover. It was very obvious, and yet Britain, all these other countries didn't lock down till later. And I think there is a kind of canard out there, the idea that this was something to do with Asia being different or authoritarian. And I think that's just rubbish. You look at London, you look at Seoul, you look at New York. Those are 3 huge cities. You probably know all of them. They're bustling metropolises, almost exactly the same size. New York has lost close to 30,000 people. London, I think, is going up towards 10,000, very sadly. And Seoul's lost a couple of hundred. And Seoul is a big, crazy, I would almost about to say Indian-style democracy. It's got nightclubs. It was one of the world's biggest nightclubs in the world. It's got K-pop. It had Parasite, which won the Oscar. His mayor got into terrible difficulties. It's a democratic, bustling place, subways, pavements, crowded, everything like that. And yet they just organized testing better than the West did. So it was a basic test of competence, which in different ways, in different places, Western governments failed. Sometimes for structural reasons. I think the American failure to have a public health system really is a big thing. But in many other cases, just through not taking government seriously.
So, and you mentioned the writing being on the wall or the cover of the book at the end of February. But may I remind you that at the end of February, Donald Trump was actually flying to India, and along with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, were addressing a rally full of unmasked, hundreds of thousands of people in a stadium that was packed. I think some of it is certainly, as you said, that it just wasn't taken seriously enough. It was seen as a Chinese problem, and then perhaps a Southeast Asian problem. There were other mistakes people made simply because they just didn't know what would work. The entire, sort of scramble for HCQ around the world, and later doctors saying this is not necessarily something we needed in such large numbers. But my question is it fair to blame the leadership given that everybody was equally clueless? Or was it about the fact that the pandemic itself was so unprecedented that perhaps we shouldn't blame people for not knowing what they should have done?
Well, several things. One, I think it is fair to blame the leaders. I think Trump made individual mistakes. Boris Johnson made individual mistakes. Just as at the moment, Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission are making mistakes about the vaccines. No doubt we'll come back to that later. Leaders did make individual mistakes, but I think you're kind of half right on the underlying thing. And in some ways, I would be much tougher. I think when you look at the league tables for COVID, if you look at which places did well, the reason why we called our book The Wake Up Call was because COVID was like an examination of a group of pupils of governments around the world. You look at pretty much every single indication, how good people's schools are, how good the healthcare system is, etc., etc. The same countries that finished top of those tables finished top of the things to do with COVID. There were one or two exceptions. I don't think any of us expected Greece to do so well. It happens to have quite a good prime minister. I think most of us think America did worse than you might have expected because of what Donald Trump's actions. But it wasn't just him. As I said, the deeper problems came back. And I think that's the point for the West. It isn't, it's sort of, to that extent, I think it's exactly the opposite of what you're saying. This was something that revealed a truth in the same way as if you suddenly set an examination to a group of pupils, you're going to get one or two who fluke it and ace the exam, and you're going to get one or two who should have done really well because the amount of preparation they've done and then didn't do quite as well. Singapore, although its numbers are sort of many, many, many times better than most Western countries, many people think it hasn't done as well as it could have done. It messed up a bit about immigrant housing and things like that. But on the whole, the broad block of things, it's the countries where there was trust in government, that were good at education, good at health. I mean, there are league tables for these things around the world, and anybody looking at it would have expected those countries to come top. And that's the real thing, is that it's like the West has not woken up in the same way as it has in terms of industry. If you remember back in the 1970s, the Japanese produced all these much smaller, better, more dynamic cars, Toyota, Honda, all those sort of things. And that swept through Western manufacturing. And what happened is places like Detroit had to come back with smaller, better cars of their own. They copied the Japanese. What's happened in government is that Singapore and places like that have come up with smaller, better government. And it's been obvious for a very long time if you look at those league tables. And now the West, I think, has to kind of start copying this. And it means a difference between taking government seriously on the one hand, but on the other hand, being fairly ruthless about the sort of people who you pull in. So Singapore gets rid of bad teachers, pays people at the top a lot. There are things we can learn, but you don't sit there and watch somebody do something 30, 40, 50 times better than you and don't react. Or that, at least the hope of our book is to point this out and say, wake up.
You have been criticized, and I'm sure you're aware of kind of making a case almost for authoritarianism, and the fact that you have praised not just Singapore, but you've essentially praised countries where people more or less followed their governments. Do you think that essentially something like the pandemic takes away the rationale, if you like, for people to believe in democracies and individual freedoms and allowing people the agency to work out their own responses?
I think, well, firstly, in terms of sort of praising liberal democracy, including sometimes in India, that is very much the end of the market that I come from. So the whole point of our book is to wake up the liberal democracies. To us, the biggest danger is the fact that people will look at the current situation. I think people are looking at this around the world. They can see it on their TV screens, and they do know the numbers. You look at the numbers, and if the world's most authoritarian big country, China, has done 30 or 40 or 50 times better than the world's, I'm not about to say biggest democracy, but that would be the wrong word. I suppose you could say leading democracy in the United States. That, I think, is something that people may draw a false positive from. And the false positive would be, as you hint, that authoritarian governments were better. But you look at the numbers, as we point out, repeat, that just isn't true. Most of the countries that did well were democracies. I mentioned some of them, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, but also places like Australia, New Zealand, some of the Nordics, Greece even, I mentioned earlier. The democracies on the whole did much better than authoritarian regimes. Places like Russia, the various stans, Iran, none of those did particularly well, and you certainly would not have wanted to get COVID in North Korea. So in general, I think authoritarian regimes didn't do particularly well, but because China did so much better than America, many people will draw the wrong lesson. As to the criticism, I think from politicians, you look, Boris Johnson, whenever he's pushed on this, begins to say, well, it's all to do with liberty and so on. It's absolute rubbish. Most of the things that involved sort of dealing with COVID are simply to do with efficiency. And throughout the West, plenty of people, and I include India in this as well, plenty of people were generally prepared, have been prepared to sacrifice bits of liberty to deal with COVID. There's nothing weird or anti-democratic about that. Ever since the birth of democracy, people have had these situations where they said, fine, okay, I'll stay in my house for a couple of weeks in order to try and get through it. You can say I'm in my house at the moment because we're in another lockdown. People are prepared to do these things. What the injustice of it really is that Western governments should have messed it up so completely that people have been willing to go through these sacrifices, and yet we haven't got the results that you would have hoped because governments have not been efficient enough.
Certainly, and what you have just said is also borne out, I think, by Australia's Lowy Institute that ranked about 98 countries on the basis of how they managed COVID. And of course, these countries that you just named that didn't do well have done badly on there. But the correlation between authoritarian versus democracy, perhaps not with that. They make an interesting point, though, that they quote Fukuyama to say essentially it's about which countries where the society trusted their leadership as opposed to those.
I think that's a really good point. I think trust did play a large role. And you can even see in places like Sweden, which basically messed up COVID. One of the reasons, but all the same, people trusted the government to get the right answer. They went for an early herd immunity answer, and they probably got it wrong, but at least there was a sort of basic idea that people thought the government was there, trying to do the right thing.
Best interest. And I should add that many think that women leaders have done better.
Exactly,
than,
that's
indeed
true.
One of the aspects, though, that in your book you have not looked at, because you have focused so much on leadership and governance as the reasons for doing better and worse on COVID. But the truth is, John, and we see it particularly in South Asia, for example, that even countries that aren't considered particularly well governed or with particularly good leadership have actually not had those big numbers. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, a big team came from the World Bank and the IMF to Kabul and studied the cases and essentially said that as many as 200,000 people could die there given the the lack of healthcare and the problems with governance and all the rest of that, eventually Afghanistan a year down the line has seen 2,400 deaths. So there are several countries, and if I may say so, it does seem as if the South, the global South,
Yes,
has not seen the kind of dramatic cases that we saw in Europe and the US. Do you think there could be other reasons as well, genetic reasons? Some have pointed out the possibility of some countries having immunity because they take the TB vaccine, the BCG, and others. Do you think that there are studies out there still to be done about just who really got hit by the pandemic, as opposed to some of these countries who frankly had no reason not to be affected the same way?
I think the answer is, like all these numbers, two things. Firstly, you're absolutely right. There is still bits of research to come through. That one, again, I don't want to give any impression that we think China has been perfect in this thing. The mere fact that China has been so reluctant to let people look at the origin of the virus, I think holds a terrible shame over that country, and that means it's harder to work these things out. I do think you are right. There's certainly results. Africa, South Asia are both examples where it's the evidence is very mixed. Even if you allow for a degree of undercounting, just purely because, as you pointed out, Afghanistan government is not famously competent in Afghanistan, so there's probably some degree of undercounting. There may well be something else going on, but most of the countries I've talked about so far have been what one would generally call kind of advanced economic countries, and the fact that you've got such wide diversions between those, I think most of that does count to competence. It's like a puzzle where you're trying to explain the reasons for something. And yes, there are, you can certainly argue that there's a degree more consensus in some Asian countries. You can argue that there's historically greater social trust in places like the Nordic countries. You can point to individual things, but a large amount of it is just about whether governments, at least to our mind, the biggest thing in this was whether your governments worked or not. And for the West point of view, it's really the culmination about 50, 60 years of not concentrating on government, not sending your best and brightest into government in the same way as it used to happen, not thinking through the way that things could work. So I think on balance, I would come down on that side, but I'm not going to pretend to you that you're wrong about these different there may be some other factors going on there, and we're always discovering things. I would say one thing very quickly on vaccines. It is possible some countries have been good at some things and useless at others. On the whole, I would, just looking at the deaths per million figure, if you're Britain is up around 1,700 deaths per million. I think in terms of being effective with the vaccine, and our government has been very effective with the vaccine, probably second only really to Israel. There they've done really, really well. But it is a little bit like a soccer match where you're 5-0 down and then you score two rather late consolation goals. And that it has that feel about it.
Well, India right now is scoring a lot of good goals for production of the vaccine and distribution of it to other countries, although the actual vaccination inside the country is yet to pick up. What's also interesting about the kind of comparisons that you've drawn between all of them is that you've looked really at countries ranged against each other. But what about global governance? At the end of the day, you have United Nations, you have the UN Security Council. On one side, you have a country like China that doesn't actually prepare the world for what it is already facing, tries to stop the story from getting out, tries to squash every kind of information that they should have been giving out. You have a United Nations that is not able to hold China accountable for this even a year later. You have on the other side countries like the UK, the US, and for some time France as well, which are in the UN Security Council. These are the veto powers of the world, the cream of global leadership. And each of them have not been able to really lead by the power of example when it comes to their healthcare systems, when it comes to containing the virus, when it comes to even getting people to wear something simple like the mask. So the question really is, has global governance failed humanity? I'm being dramatic here, but really, do we just need to reinvent the United Nations and new forms of global governance?
I think definitely. I mean, yes, you're right. I think on one, you're right on several different levels. First, that I think the relative failure of the West to deal with these issues does make it does increase the case, which I know Mr. Modi is seldom ashamed about making, that when you look at things like the Security Council, if you've got people on it who have been basically proved incompetent in this, why are they being entrusted with those decisions? I think people can reasonably ask that. I think more generally on the issue of global governance, I think you're right. I think perhaps we could have done more on that. I think that in general, I think your global governance has had a very bad COVID. You could argue just on kind of regional governance, the EU was pretty useless on both cases. It was slow to get going, and now it's messed up vaccines. So that's a sort of regional thing. I think on global, again, we've seen that you correctly pointed out the weaknesses of WHO. I think here, though, I think you should probably, this is the one area where I think you can really point towards Trump and say that is where he was a complete disaster, because historically, when there has been a crisis like this, the world's most powerful country, and I think we have to say that America is still the world's most powerful country, that would lead the world. You look at the financial crises, you look at the last financial crisis, America was there with China, with others doing things. In this particular case, Donald Trump did not even unite the West, let alone uniting the world. And I think
or even the United States.
Or indeed the United States, yes, that's true. But I think oddly that, and I'm not trying to make a political point here, but I'm merely trying to make a sort of, I think just a pragmatic one. If you're Joe Biden and you come into office, there are some very bad things, I think, in wait for you, which I can spell out, which are along the lines of, do not for a second think that all the problems with the American government are to do with Donald Trump. And we can come back to those because they go much deeper. They go across everything like education and so on. But internationally, you do have a real chance to try uniting the world around America. Under Trump, the message of America first was toxic. Because America used to, if you're in a contest with a power like China, which is what Trump said America was, you win those contests, just like America won the last Cold War, by doing two things, by getting allies on your side. Well, Trump failed spectacularly with that, but also by talking about things like freedom and democracy and those sort of values, which you mentioned earlier. Because if you just simply say America first, that is not a particularly seductive message to the rest of the world. And there, I think that is where Biden has a real opportunity. And actually, if I was him, I would also look at the idea of the democracies. And it matters not just with dealing with COVID, but with that second sort of geopolitical challenge I talked about. Because I'm going to put this very simply, I think you could argue whether America is more powerful than China. I would tend to say America is more powerful. You can argue that whether Europe is more powerful than China, maybe China's more powerful than Europe. The one thing which is absolutely clear is that, first, America and Europe together are more powerful than China under any kind of economic might, military might, whatever you want to put it together. And even more powerful is if you bring all the democracies together. If you bring in Indonesia, you bring in India, you bring in the big democracies of Asia onto that side of the ledger, then everything changes. So, yeah, if I was Biden, I would really focus on a policy that is about bringing those democracies in, including India. In fact, India would possibly be very, very high at the top of your list.
All right. I know I have time for a few more questions here, so I'm going to try and get you to, in a nutshell, tell us about Bill Lincoln. The idea that the world really and Western governments need Bill Lincoln, and I should point out that's not Bill Clinton and Abraham Lincoln, but I'll allow you to explain.
Well, it's all very well laying out all these problems about what's gone wrong with the West, but we wanted to look at one particular country and say, what would you do to reform it? And so we chose America because we thought that's the biggest democracy and it had an election going on. And we invented a president, and various people, and you hinted at it earlier, said that what we should have done is we should have grabbed Jacinda Ardern and Angela Merkel and combined them. And then you'd had two women modern leaders to do it. But what we did somewhat retrospectively is that we reached back into the 19th century and grabbed the two sort of figures then who we thought America most needs now. And one was Abraham Lincoln, the famous president of America, and the other was William Gladstone, the 4 times liberal leader of Britain. And the point about both of these people is that they tried to make government much better, especially when it came to helping the poor, but they had no time at all for the boondoggles for the rich. They specialized in ripping things out that they thought were just there. So if you look at the American tax code, for instance, we point out there's $1.6 trillion worth of exemptions, nearly all of which go to the rich. That's the sort of thing that with Abraham Lincoln and William Gladstone, or Bill Lincoln, as we put them together, that's the kind of thing they would deal with. And we use this figure. I think it's a really important thing. We didn't say you're a magical answer to all problems. We said that Bill Lincoln can only use what works elsewhere. So it's not saying doesn't have to come up with some magical thing. So if you look at healthcare, you borrow from Singapore, you borrow from Germany. If you look at education, you borrow from places like Korea, the Nordics. You pull in the best ideas in exactly the same way as any company does nowadays. You know, you cannot be second best in an area, and you copy the things that work.
Sure. I do want to also ask about the kind of impact COVID has had on some of the freedoms that we had not experienced, you know, in under so much duress before. I mean, it's an autocrat's dream. You cannot go out to protest because of the coronavirus. If somebody is arrested, you might not even find out about it because there's, you know, it's tough for journalists to get out there in the middle of a pandemic. You know, in many ways, a pandemic becomes a dream for any autocratic government. In India, we have seen a lot of restrictions on things like public protests or on journalists, which just coincidentally or otherwise have increased during the coronavirus pandemic. Also, the idea that when everybody is facing a threat, it becomes easier for the government to then tell everyone, you know, you have to get behind the plan. You have to get behind the government. You cannot ask questions because we're in the middle of a crisis here. Do you think that has now become a global phenomenon?
I think the answer is that has been a global phenomenon, and the real test will become as the disease recedes. Again, as I said, you know, historically, there has always been an acceptance by people that you do have some suppression of freedoms when these things happen. One thing we found out in the book is Thomas Hobbes, as I said, we began with the great kind of first book on government, Leviathan. Well, that came out just shortly before the Great Plague of London. The Great Plague of London, what happened was that every family that had the plague, you were only allowed to go outside you were barely allowed to go outside, but when you went outside, you had to carry a white stick so people could run away from you. A terrible imposition of kind of, you know, authoritarian regime. But people accepted that because it was a way of keeping alive. And I think the danger in this particular thing is that people, yes, you're absolutely right, including in India, some people have advocated or taken powers that are much more draconian than needed. But the claim is always that they're going to give them back to us. And so we must wait and see. But I think I completely sympathize. You know, I'm from the liberal end of the thing. I'm worried about this, but I think you have to be realistic. We are dealing with a plague, and on the whole, that means you have to do some degree of confining people. I would just say one last thing on that. I think what's true is that politicians all the way across the world, even people as naturally gifted as Mr. Modi, have made mistakes in dealing with it. It's been very difficult, and so that has made politicians much more difficult to deal with generally for journalists, I think. So even the ones who haven't tried to grab authoritarian powers have had difficulties with this.
And nobody wants to deal with criticism all the time. I do want to ask you, because you talked about some of the lessons that corporates have learned. One of the questions that the pandemic should have made us ask, perhaps, is really, are we looking at question of growth wrong? Are we just looking at it through this GDP prism on year growth, on the idea that we have to keep making more and more money each year instead of looking at health security and looking at food security, at the fact that people need to be to have well-being rather than just making more money every year. You have been in the news, Bloomberg has been in the news for the media layoffs as well. And of course, we've seen this across the industry. So the question really is, are there lessons that should have been learned during the pandemic about changing priorities for the corporate world, perhaps, that you think should be held on to?
I think on the whole, I mean, obviously some corporations done badly, some have done well, etc. But on the whole, I think the lessons, and I'm not trying to duck the questions, but I think that the main thing is actually on the society side. I think when you talk about systems that make huge amounts of money, I think your example of New York is actually very pertinent. You had one of the places where many people have made huge sums of money, New York, and yet when COVID struck, two things. Firstly, people at the bottom started dying in huge numbers. You had the appalling sight of nurses wearing garbage bags because there wasn't enough equipment to keep them, but to protect them. You had that in one of the richest cities of the world. I think people found that appalling. But the other thing about COVID is wealth in the end was not a break against it. And that actually is a very old lesson. If you look at the origins of the modern welfare state, you go back to places like the slums of London 120 years ago, and there were two sorts of people arguing for reform then, for bringing in health systems, for bringing in education, doing things. One were liberal-minded people who wanted to help the poor for themselves, but there were also conservatives who wanted to do it for two reasons. One is that it eventually occurred to them that if you have slums that breed disease, well, then there's nothing to stop them reaching the richer neighborhoods. And that has happened exactly the same. And the second thing, which is actually really interesting, is a lot of the people who actually built the institutions or voted for the kind of new, more quote unquote socialist institutions like health services and so on, they included people like Winston Churchill, which, as you know, was a very conservative, not generally given to sort of soft feelings in that regard. And the reason why is because they saw this as a crucial part of national competition. They saw at the time it was a reason to compete with Germany. Germany seemed to have a better fighting force than Britain. And Churchill and people like that were prepared to sort of educate the masses in order to take that on. And so in the precise answer is, I think that these richer societies are being taught lessons about how you need to bring along the poor with you. And I think that does get back to things like universal healthcare and things like that.
So I think, is this pandemic going to make socialists of everyone? I know your background is certainly not
I hope not. I hope not. I think as the many sins of that Britain has gave India, Fabianism was one of them. No, I think the danger in this is that effectively at the end of it, and this is one reason why we brought in Bill Lincoln, is that you look at the answers to COVID. There are kind of two really big false ones. We've covered one already, which is the idea that you somehow have to be authoritarian. That's rubbish. The second one is that the answer is more government. Well, if you look at the size of government, the sprawl of government over the past 40, 50 years, the one thing which is unquestionable in the West is that government has generally got bigger, it's done more things, and it hasn't got better. And what's intriguing about the models in East Asia, Singapore being the kind of starting point, is you actually go for smaller government, but you make sure that it's targeted on things where it can really make a difference. And I think there is quite a lot in that. So I think you are right that there will be a drift to the left. People are going to ask their governments to do more, but that may not be actually a good thing, but partly because governments will spend a lot more and they're going to get into debt. And I think that ultimately is something that causes problems, but also because in the end, you want to have government that is targeted and useful. People like me should not be getting free bus passes. Neither should Mick Jagger, neither should Bruce Springsteen, all of whom qualify these things at the moment. That's wrong.
Interesting you should say so, because there's the debate in India too about why everybody should have government funded vaccines, and why not let people pay, some people who can afford it pay for their own. There's so many questions that come out of this pandemic, and many of them, as you pointed out, actually turn the focus on us, not just as citizens, but as society. And I think the question is going to go on. I could hazard a guess that you are going to be putting together a sequel sometime soon. And I certainly hope that one of the lasting effects of the pandemic, which is that you and I have to meet over this
hopefully
kind
in
of
person
format,
in Jaipur.
rather than in person, will be a thing of the past. But there are other efficiencies that we are all going to learn to live with. But John Micklethwait, this has been a delightful conversation. Thank you so much for speaking with us here at JLF. I'm Suhasini Haidar.
Suhasini, thank you very much.
Thank you, John and Suhasini, for that riveting conversation. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful session. We thank our celebration partner, Diageo. Thank you all for watching and being such a lovely audience. I do hope you will stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we have also struggled to ensure that we continue to bring to you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We do hope you will support us at Teamwork Arts. Any contribution would help spread knowledge and ideas seamlessly against all odds. Please do tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 at Jaipur Lit Fest. The festival is protected by Dettol. We do hope to see you in our next session. Thank you.